Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit.
I will never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag of the United States of America or our country. Let me just tell you what I see or what I feel when the national anthem is played and when I look at the flag of the United States. I envision my two grandfathers who fought for this country during World War II, one in the Army and one in the Marine Corps, both risking their lives to protect our country and to try to make our country and this world a better place. And is everything right with our country right now? No, it's not. We still have a long way to go. But I think what you do by standing there and showing respect to the flag with your hand over your heart is it shows unity.
Lynching in America, targeting Black veterans. Lynching in America, targeting Black veterans by the Equal Justice Initiative. The end of the Civil War marked a new era of racial terror and violence directed at Black people in the United States that had not been adequately acknowledged or addressed in this country. Following emancipation in 1865, thousands of freed Black men, women, and children were killed by white mobs, former slave owners, and members of the Confederacy who were unwilling to accept the anticipated end of slavery and racial subordination. The violent response to freedom for former slaves was followed by decades of racial terror and lynchings and targeted violence designed to sustain white supremacy and racial hierarchy. No one was more at risk of experiencing violence and targeted racial terror than Black veterans who had proven their valor and courage as soldiers during the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Because of their military service, Black veterans were seen as a particular threat to Jim Crow and racial subordination. Thousands of Black veterans were assaulted, threatened, abused, or lynched following military service. The disproportionate abuse and assaults against Black veterans have never been fully acknowledged. This report highlights the particular challenges endured by Black veterans in the hope that our nation can better confront the legacy of this violence and terror. No community is more deserving of recognition and acknowledgement than those Black men and women veterans who bravely risked their lives to defend this country's freedom, only to have their own freedom denied and threatened because of racial bigotry. A poem. Look here, America, what you done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now, your policemen, let your mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took his lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must be in Beaumont that had his start. 'Cause everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crow'd me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very hour. Yet, you say we're fighting for democracy. Then, why don't democracy include me? I ask this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. By Langston Hughes, 1943. From the end of the Civil War to the years following World War II, thousands of African Americans were victims of lynchings and other forms of racial terror in the United States, often in violent and public acts of torture that traumatized Black communities throughout the country. The terror and violence of the lynching era profoundly impacted race relations and shaped the geographical, social, and economic conditions of African Americans in ways that are still evident today. Lynching and racial violence fueled the migration of millions of Black people from the South into urban ghettos in the North and West during the first half of the 20th century, and created a social environment where racial subordination and segregation was maintained with limited official resistance. This violence reinforced a legacy of racial inequality that has never been adequately addressed and continues to be evident in the injustice and unfairness of the administration of criminal justice in America. Military service sparked dreams of racial equality for generations of African Americans. But most Black veterans were never welcomed home and honored for their service. Instead, during the lynching era, many Black veterans were targeted for mistreatment, violence, and murder because of their race and status as veterans. Indeed, Black veterans risked violence simply by wearing their uniforms on American soil. The United States condoned the racial terror and Jim Crow segregation that plagued the entire Black population, even as it purported to fight for freedom and democracy and against fascism and racism abroad. This report is a supplement to Lynching in America, confronting the legacy of racial terror that specifically examines the history of racial violence targeting African American veterans in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Between the end of Reconstruction and the years following World War II, thousands of Black veterans were accosted, assaulted, and attacked, and many were lynched. Black veterans died at the hands of mobs and persons acting under the color of official authority. Many survived near lynchings, and countless others suffered severe assaults and social humiliation. Documenting these atrocities is vital to understanding the incongruity of our country's professed ideals of freedom and democracy while tolerating ongoing violence against people of color, specifically Black people within our borders. As veterans and later civil rights leader Hosea Williams said, "I had fought in World War II, and I once was captured by the German army. And I want to tell you, the Germans were never as inhumane as the state troopers of Alabama." The Equality Justice Initiative believes that understanding The persecution of African American veterans is an important step towards understanding the extent that racial violence and hatred terrorized Black Americans in the century following emancipation. To be continued.